Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in about 60 seconds, if you could just settle in. Welcome to our second annual Interprofessional Campus-Wide Day of Action. I am Regine Diacroix. I am the Director of the Office of Diversity at the Mailman School of Public Health and an Assistant Professor in Social Medical Sciences. I will be your host, and moderator for today. Today, the CUIMC Professional Health Schools will learn together through presentations, experiential learning, workshops, and advocacy sessions so that our future health professionals can be better equipped to articulate the importance of mutually respectful and responsible interprofessional collaboration in caring for patients, families, and communities, describe how roles and responsibilities of members within interprofessional healthcare teams complement one another, identify key resources and perspectives that will facilitate just and equitable healthcare, identify opportunities for individuals to advocate for health equity. Our coming together as a community is particularly important at this time, as 2019 marks the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first Africans to be sold into bondage in North America. A calculation along with the genocide of our indigenous populations and colonization that would make this nation one of the wealthiest, ensuring its existence. We are a nation built on the idea that some of us are simply more human than others, more deserving of life than others. We have all, in small and not so small ways, become inured to this idea. I hope you will join me today in disrupting what we have come to accept as normal. I am pleased to introduce Courtney Cogburn, who will start us off through her talk, Culture, Racism, and Health, Implications for Population Health and Methodological Innovations. Dr. Cogburn is interested in the ways we characterize and measure racism and the effects of racism on racial inequalities in health. She is focused on examining the effects of cultural racism in the media on acute physiological, psychological, and behavioral stress responses, as well as associations between chronic psychosocial stress exposure and black-white disparities in cardiovascular health and disease. She is also developing a project using data science to explore links between media-based racism and population health. Dr. Cogburn is the lead creator of 1,000 Cut Journey, an immersive virtual reality racism experience that was developed in collaboration with the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford University, and which premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018. The team is now exploring the use of the VR experience in affecting empathy, racial bias, structural competence, and behavior. Prior to Columbia, Dr. Cogburn was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies. She holds a BA in Psychology from the University of Virginia, an MSW from the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and a Ph.D. in the combined program in Education and Psychology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Cogburn is also a board member of the International Center Advocates Against Discrimination. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Cogburn. A reminder, her session will be followed by Q&A, so as she is presenting, please think of your questions, and we'll open question and answer session at 10:15. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We get to start our day talking about racism. How fun. So my work is really grounded in thinking about why race matters for health. And really that sort of stems from this argument that race in and of itself doesn't cause or influence anything, that it's what comes along with checking that box, right? One of my mentors likes to say, if it's just a matter of checking the box black, you could just check a different box and all your problems would go away. So black doesn't equal disease. There's something that comes along with that experience that's meaningful for us to assess and understand. And in fact, I would argue, and others would argue, that if we don't interrogate the source of the categorical differences that we observe when we assess racial disparities in health, that what remains is a bio-racist frame. We're assuming that there's something essential about the category of black that's telling us something about disease patterns, rather than digging deeper and figuring out why we're observing those patterns by race. My work is also grounded in this notion that the struggle against oppression and exploitation is most powerfully resisted and maintained on cultural terrain. So my recent work is starting to think about what ways do we use language and imagery and symbols to convey a sense of humanity or lack of humanity, deservingness, value, etc., that dictate our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So I'm going to share two components of my work today. So one is the maintenance part. How do we use culture to maintain oppression? So I'll share with you a paper that's coming out soon that's thinking about transdisciplinary framings of how we should be thinking about cultural threats to health. So drawing on multiple disciplinary perspectives on what culture is and how it may function to create threats for health. And then a methodological contribution thinking about how do we leverage the use of culture and sharing the virtual reality project that I've been working on with a team at Stanford. So the use of culture is becoming increasingly popular. It's becoming popular again in our language around population health. So in our growing commitment to think about social determinants comes along this use of culture. So in Healthy People 2020, the language, the aggregate of social and cultural institutions, norms, patterns, beliefs, and processes that influence the life of an individual or community. RWJF, we like to call him Uncle Bob, thinks about the culture of health, shared national priority for health for all, which includes creating healthier and more equitable communities. Now, these are important framings. This is an important shift, but we need to unpack what we mean by these things. The aggregate of social and cultural institutions, norms, patterns, etc., that's really hard to measure. That's really difficult to conceptualize. So my argument is that we need to pull from existing work that helps us think more carefully about what we mean by that and how we might go about measuring it. So a gap that I see in this existing discourse is an under-conceptualization of what culture means, narrow frames of what might be conceived as cultural threat, and studying race without racism. So a failure to integrate established conceptual, methodological, policy, and practice recommendations. There's a large body of work that's been thinking carefully about what race means in relation to health, how we conceptualize racism, how we might measure racism, and there's still an ongoing failure to integrate those conceptual models and methodologies into the general population health literature. There are people who think about cultural racism. This is not a new concept. This is a long-standing acknowledgement of the significance of cultural processes and cultural systems. So in structural racism models, they think about cultural processes that reinforce structures and institutions. We think about cultural systems of various sorts and various ways that we promote senses of white superiority. And also thinking about racism in this form as a stressor. So being exposed to symbols, languages, etc., that can produce a form of racism-related stress. There are also gaps in this area. So thinking about a disconnect between these rich conceptual models around racism and then the empirical literature not taking the next step to actually measure those phenomena. Empirically dominant focus on individual experiences. So much of what we understand about the association between racism and health is grounded in assessments of racial discrimination. Individual experiences with being treated differently on the basis of race, being followed in a store, receiving inadequate health care, etc., but not thinking about these broader macro phenomena. And then there's limited explicit grounding in cultural frameworks, even when it does show up in the empirical work. So there are 3 papers for those of you who are interested in this space. These are 3 contemporary papers that I think do a really great job of framing these issues in relation to health. One is from Maggie Hicken and colleagues in social science and medicine. The top 2 came out in 2018, and mine is coming out soon. But all of these think about multiple disciplinary perspectives on culture and how we should be thinking about how it should inform our assessments of racial inequalities in health. So transdisciplinary framings of culture are needed to understand culture in relation to health. I would argue, that cultural racism informs stereotypes, beliefs, narratives, and decision and meaning making, as well as our behavior. So what we believe, what we think, and how we act are driven often in invisible and passive ways through cultural narratives. And also that cultural racism creates socially toxic environments, that we're consistently surrounded with imagery and narratives that actually might trigger disease processes that can be problematic, especially if that exposure is chronic. So I'll quickly talk about 3 different boxes of cultural racism, and I draw from this model from Lamont and Hall, who think about how to frame social inequalities and how we produce social inequalities, and then I'm applying this specifically to race and racism. So symbolic boundaries reference the ways in which we establish our principles of value and status. So these are racial frames and ideologies. This includes things like stereotype threat, who's smart, who's not, who do we stigmatize, who do we not. Status hierarchies refer to who do we center versus who do we push to the margins. Who do we treat as normal or as our defaults in when we think about health, for instance, and who do we treat as deviations from the norm. Also collective imaginary, so the ways that we use really thinking about patterns of symbols, language, and narratives. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean. But in total, these represents a cultural system. So it's not just stereotypes, it's not just biased media, it's a combination of these things that create a cultural system that create often invisible narratives around race and racism. So one example, dog whistles from political science. This is a quote from a headline talking about Paul Ryan referring to blaming poverty on lazy inner city men. He doesn't reference black people, he doesn't use race explicitly, but he's using what one might call racially coded language. In this same interview, Paul Ryan cites a scholar who suggests that blacks are genetically inferior. So Paul Ryan doesn't say blacks are genetically inferior, he cites someone else who says it in the context of saying poverty should be blamed on lazy inner city men. So these are really complex language patterns that are often, again, depending, a dog whistle is, does it perk up particular ears and elicit negative racial sentiment without having to use blatant racist language. We also see patterns in terms of how we, and this comes from media and communication studies, we see patterns in how we treat black victims as opposed to white victims, white assailants who shoot up a church being treated as a victim, being provided food, being taken care of, having his mental health carefully considered, while others may not be given the same considerations. This is a snippet from an elementary school textbook where it says, when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlements. So this is also cultural racism, whitewashing of history, and one would argue a complete, utter misrepresentation of history. So there are also sociologists who talk very carefully about what some of these symbolic boundaries might be. So Bonilla Silva, in his text, Racism Without Racists, talks about racial ideologies as interpretive tools that are used to explain and justify racial inequality. How do we go about explaining the racial patterns that we observe in society? Some people, for instance, who look at mass incarceration, think of that as a problem of crime, and that because it's a problem of crime, we need to be tough on crime. Others would think about the problem of mass incarceration as being rooted in issues like drug policy and housing policy, and thus would target the problem from that level. So Bonilla Silva talks about the ways in which we attach race to our narratives around social inequalities. Fagan also talks about, in the white racial frame, how we curate whiteness and otherness through racial ideologies, although we rarely explicitly name whiteness. I was giving a talk at a community health center just recently, and just my mentioning white people and whiteness seemed to send the room into tense faces and bodies. That is a racial group that's worth talking about in the context of racism. But Fagan talks about that specifically in terms of curating this sense of whiteness, often in an invisible way, that guides meaning-making action, attitudes, and behaviors. So these cultural systems end up shaping, again, narratives, right? So these cultural systems, for instance, the popular trope, or not so popular now, but trope of welfare queens, and the ways in which that might lead to policy decisions, because we've created this image of who's using welfare or misusing welfare, and we use that to then guide our justified discrimination policy. And I would argue exposure to this type of content also produces stress. Similarly, Paul Ryan blaming poverty on lazy inner city men, it's not just this one headline, it's a narrative when we continue to talk about particular issues in a pattern that creates a system that then might dictate the way that we address approach policy solutions, for instance. So And some policy, practice, and attitudes are shaped by these cultural systems, as well as social toxicity, creating a sense of stress in one psychosocial environment. So what does this mean for medicine and public health? Medicine and public health have been criticized for treating social determinants of health as facts to be known rather than conditions to be challenged and changed. So naming and talking about social determinants without actually then taking the next step to address and deal with those issues. Talking about poverty but not oppression. Why are people in poverty? How do we get to that particular social pattern? Talking about race but not racism. We keep talking about differences in cardiovascular disease or differences in mental health, mental illness, but not then taking the next step to say, why are we observing those patterns by race? If we don't take that next step, we're assuming that there's something meaningful about the racial category in and of itself. And if our science stays in that place without continuing to the next step to actually think about why we're seeing those patterns and what we might do about it, again, one would argue, I would argue, and others would argue that we're left with a bio-racist frame. So here's some options for reframing how we approach racial health disparities. Thinking about health inequities rather than disparities. So not just differences in health, but again, the systems and structures that led to those differences in the first place. Acknowledging that racism is a fundamental cause, and in doing so, and by meaning a fundamental cause, meaning that racism predicts the socioeconomic indicators that also explain health. And we also observe consistently an independent effect between racism-related stress and health outcomes. And as a result, you have to directly address racism, not just the socioeconomic factors, and not just in order to have an effect on these racial inequalities. Targeting racism will require multi-sector, equity-oriented policies, as well as integrating social theories that examine race and racism. So in order to go beyond descriptions by race and categorical differences by race, we have to then think about how do we integrate existing social theories that have thought about how these social patterns get produced, and how do we integrate that meaningfully into our health research and practice. It's also been suggested that we focus on structural competence as opposed to cultural competence. So again, building a competence around how do systems, policies, et cetera, help produce these patterns, and not just thinking about some groups are different and do things differently, right? That would be the latter on the cultural competence side. Also thinking about racism as a potential source of social toxicity, the ways in which we're exposed to imagery, et cetera, that might produce these problematic health patterns. And all of this will require innovation in methodology, measurement, data use, and creation. And so what I would argue is, are we more interested in writing papers, or are we more interested in addressing the problems that face us? Often existing data, the data we have that's handy, that will allow us to write papers quickly, is not actually addressing the problems that we're facing in relation to race and racial inequalities. So we also need, in addition to thinking more creatively about existing data, we also need innovations in how we're trying to assess these problems. So here are some thoughts about how we might leverage culture. So I've been thinking a lot about this intersection of social justice and emerging technology. How might we use emerging technologies to intervene on these cultural issues? This has led me explicitly to think about whiteness and white liberalism in particular, right? So if we think about public health, we think about social work, which is the space where I'm grounded. These are people who espouse beliefs of justice and equality, but in my experience often fall short in truly understanding the nature of racial inequality and racial injustice. And figuring that they need to be a group that we engage to think more deeply about these issues. There's a series in the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof called "When Whites Just Don't Get It," where he says, where he's providing a lot of data around structural patterns around race, so housing inequality, job and employment inequities, et cetera. And some of the responses that he got in response to this was probably has something to do with their unwillingness to work. We can't fix their problems. If blacks are poor or in prison, it's all their fault. We all start from zero. So I would argue that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of racial oppression and the legacy of racial oppression in our country. This is evident in our public discourse, but it's also evident in these spaces. It's also evident in public health. It's also evident in social work, where we target and think about individuals and how to fix individuals and make them the source of the problem, rather than thinking about the context and systems in which they exist and addressing those as part of the problem as well. There's also this tendency to focus on individual levels of bias and also getting a pass for having that bias, right? One of my favorite Broadway musicals, Avenue Q, everybody's a little bit racist, right? We're all a little bit biased, we're all a little bit racist, which also ignores histories and legacies of oppression and systems of oppression. So there's a tendency to think, well, I would never put on a hood or go to a meeting, so I'm not racist, right? So then you get a gold star and you're not racist, and you get a pass, and as long as you're not racist, then it's all good. What I would argue that your individual level of bias, or whether you're racist or not, is irrelevant to systems of racial oppression, and whether you're engaged in anti-racist action. So you don't get a gold star for thinking that you're not biased or that you're not racist, because that's not the same thing as actively engaging systems of racist oppression. So in my work, in this virtual reality work, I'm thinking specifically about white liberal audiences. And people ask me, are you targeting the choir? Aren't you preaching to the choir? And I say, yes, I'm absolutely preaching to the choir. Because I think it's a choir worth preaching to. I think it's a needle that we can actually move. And I also think it's the group that's most likely to believe that they get it and understand it and don't. So how do we get the group who already believes they get it and understand it to grow and deepen their engagement and understanding, and to question what they think they know and understand? How do we get more people to think about, rather than attempting to control expression of culturally constituted individual bias, and think about a more effectual use of their personal agency? One way may be to have them reconstruct worlds that promote anti-racist tendencies. So how do we get people to move beyond their individual designation, their gold star, and think more about how they're engaging systems of power and oppression? And galvanizing effective collective action to address racial inequality requires that more of us understand what racism actually is. So can immersive VR help influence the ways that we engage racism? I like to use this quote, sorry for the misplaced line there, from Ta-Nehisi Coates, that I think really reflects what's important about this work in virtual reality, where he says, but all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it lodges brains, blocks airways, tips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. More of us need to understand that. More of us need to feel that to some degree in order to engage differently around these issues. That's the premise of the virtual reality work. So I developed this work with funding from the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, which is housed in the School of Journalism. I'll put a plug, because they asked me to, that they have something called Magic Grants that are open to anyone. If you have a big idea that's thinking about ways of using media in a different way, no matter how you're applying it, you should consider applying. The deadline, I think, is like in a week. So we took a transdisciplinary approach to thinking about this, so not just sort of pulling on individual areas of expertise, but bringing a team together, computer scientists, artists, social workers, psychologists, communication scholars, etc., all coming together to think about this same problem and to address this same problem. How might we pull from our different perspectives to solve this really complicated issue? So what we created was, well, first let me get a sense of who in the audience has experienced or used virtual reality before, just by raise of hands. And how many of you have done something other than watching 360 videos, like something that you would watch on your phone? How many have been like an avatar or something else? Okay. So in this experience, we created a digital immersive experience where you become a black male as a child, an adolescent, and as an adult, experiencing racism in different forms at different points in your life. So we actually have you embody this character where if you move, the character moves, you can grab and interact with objects, the environment can also engage and interact with you, and the environment can also change its response to you. So in the first scene in early childhood, we have you in an elementary school classroom, the red blocks, the colorful blocks in front of you, you're able to grab and throw. The three kids there are joking and teasing, saying things like, Mike, you're Michael Sterling, Mike, throw the blocks, throw the fireball, throw the scary black fireball. Black is always the scariest color. So we're using language from the kids and this sort of taunting, and we're using that to encourage you to throw the blocks. And to my amazement, like 98% of people throw the blocks, and they usually throw it at that kid on the right who says, the scary black fireball. When you do that, your throwing the block actually triggers another video, which is a white female teacher who's off to the side who says, Mike, you're being dangerous. You're going to hurt someone. And you get placed in timeout. So what's interesting is that we're not just sort of creating things that we think are familiar. We actually base this on empirical data around disciplinary practices in the classroom and how black children are disciplined differently for the same behavior and more harshly for the same behavior than white children. In the second scene, you transition, you're in a mirror, you see yourself become a little bit older, you're in your teen bedroom, you can grab and play with this basketball, you can bounce it, you can throw it into the hoop that's on the back of your door. There's a news alert on your computer screen that says an unarmed black teen has been killed by a police officer. You get a phone call from your white friend who says, come down, we're going to be late for the basketball game. You then transition to your living room where you see your mother who's sitting on the couch, who's watching the news. She asks you to stop because the police are looking for someone who's wearing something similar to you, and she wants you to change. Your white friend resists and says, it's not a big deal, just hurry, come on. And your mother says, don't forget what happened to your brother. You then grab your hoodie and put it on, and you leave the house. You're now standing on a street in Brooklyn. The neighbors are waving, wishing you good luck at the game, and all of a sudden a police car pulls up, start yelling, telling you to get down on your knees and put your hands up. And we have you, the user, in the headset, get down on your knees and put your hands in the air while police officers are cursing and yelling at you. You've done nothing but stand there on the sidewalk. We based that scene on stop and frisk practices in New York City, and the scene with the mother was based on a story shared with me by a student. You then transition to, I want to finish this scene. So in this scene, the police officers are yelling at you, and then the lights go off and the sound goes off, and it's just dark, and you hear your mother's voice saying, just do what you have to do to get home alive. When you come to, everyone's saying, are you okay? Do you want me to call your mother? Your white friend says, man, that was crazy. Just brush it off. Let's just get to the game. Completely misunderstanding the gravity of what's just happened. In the final scene, you transition into adulthood. You're applying for a job. You approach a desk with your resume where you can see a Yale logo. We're trying to give you some information. I have no affiliation with Yale. We're trying to give you some information about your qualifications for the position. The receptionist refuses to actually take it from you and sort of points that you should put it in the tray. She then directs you over to the couch where you see the other candidate to the left who blackens the way he speaks to you casually before the interviewer approaches. As soon as the interviewer approaches, he turns back to a preppier voice as he talks to the interviewer. The interviewer approaches the white male directly, completely ignores your presence, and says, you must be our candidate from Yale. We're so excited to meet you. The receptionist then corrects him and says, actually, Michael Sterling is our candidate from Yale, when they turn and acknowledge your presence for the first time. You don't mind if I take him back, do you? We'll be right with you. You get a phone call later saying that while you're qualified, you're not a good cultural fit for the organization. So this gives you a sense of what it looks like when you're looking in the mirror. This is a draft of the classroom that you saw earlier. So when you move your hands, the avatar moves their hands at the same time, the head moves at the same time, the body moves at the same time as well. We also were very interested in building interactivity into the experience. So we wanted you to use the body. In addition to seeing your face and seeing the body in a mirror, we also wanted you to use your hands and your body. So getting down on your knees and putting your hands up, for instance. I want to show you the trailer.
Mike, look at me.
Leave that boy alone.
Black is always the scariest.
He didn't do anything wrong.
I know what that
Black fireball, Mike. Make
You can't leave here dressed like that.
is. Us against
Think
them.
dangerous? I shouldn't have to tell you.
Sorry, didn't notice you there.
Just brush it off.
You have now become Mike Sterling. Look at yourself in the mirror.
So what was important for us in this experience was it's not just the one time someone calls you a name. It's not something that only happens in adulthood. It's not something that only happens at work. It starts very early in life that you carry with you over and over and over again. You're experiencing these sorts of things across multiple contexts. That's the notion of a 1,000-cut journey. And it's not always a police officer yelling in your face. It can be the dismissive way people talk about racial disparities in health in your classroom. Well-intentioned, good white liberals misestimating the significance of policy and structures and culture and contributing to the patterns of being observed. Treating diabetes as a problem that needs to be resolved by fixing someone's diet and not acknowledging the structures and systems in place that restrict access to healthy foods and being able to be active outside. Continuing to blame the individual for broad, consistent, and persistent problems that we observe in health. If only we fix the individuals, if only the individuals could get their stuff together, we'd all be better off. The argument here is only if we could all get it together, we would all be better off. So we're running a series of studies thinking about what the psychological, cognitive, and behavioral implications are of going through an experience like this. So we're running studies where we're tracking changes in things like empathy and racial bias, as well as structural competence over time. We also collect data when we do these events mobilely, so we're able to collect data in the actual headset, where we can have people sign a petition, whether they're willing to support a race-related policy, for instance. And we're also starting a new project where we're thinking about ways to integrate data visualization into virtual reality. So thinking about all of this data that we have around structural racism, for instance, and how we might combine that with complex narratives like the one I just showed you in virtual reality in an effort to better help people think something other than we all start from zero. So what I believe is that achieving racial justice requires that we understand racism, and not an understanding that emerges from intellectual exercise or even in the consumption or production of science, but rather a visceral understanding that connects the spirit and body as much as reason. We need to start having different conversations, and our hope is that going through an experience like this helps our conversation start in a different place and helps people engage these questions differently than they may have before they went into the headset. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
So if you all could, can you hear me on this? Great. If you could come to the mic if you have questions, and same for up above, that would be great. And the mics are located in the aisles.
Hi, Dr. Cogburn. Thank you so much for this talk. This was amazing. I'm a fourth-year medical student starting over the summer in my training in obstetrics and gynecology. There's been a lot of research that's been emerging about racial disparities in maternal mortality, morbidity. I was wondering how you think this might be applied to this issue.
So I think in healthcare settings, in my experience in public health settings, we need to be having a different conversation about the problem. And I think with maternal health, the data is so striking that it's hard to blame the individual, right? You have to start thinking about social determinants in a substantive way. But I also think that we may have to recognize that the people in the room may not be equipped to actually understand the problem, and that we need to bring in other people with different perspectives than our own. So someone classically trained in medicine, for instance, that doesn't have additional training in public health or social work or sociology, for instance, may not be very well equipped to think carefully about the problem of maternal health and racial problems. So I would say we have to diversify who we're bringing to the table to think about how we address those issues. And so that conversation becomes critical for what we then decide to do. Sometimes we jump to an intervention, we jump to a solution, we jump to a policy, oh, let's put doulas in place, or let's think about these solutions, which may or may not to say that you don't do that, but sometimes we think about a Band-Aid solution and not think about what's contributing to the problem more broadly. So is it care in the system? Is it care leading up to before they come to the hospital, before you even get to your OBGYN? Are there stress-related issues? Are we listening to people when they tell us they're in pain? And we ourselves may not always be the best people to reflect carefully about whether we're doing that or not.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Huda. I'm also a fourth-year medical student. With regards to this VR technology, where do you see like the most ideal space to be using this, like on which people? Because I feel like, I don't know, maybe giving it to people like Paul Ryan and the other like senators might be something useful.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Paul Ryan. I'm not sure I want to talk to him, but but I do think policymakers are an important target audience. We've been thinking about it in a couple of different ways. So one, we've thought about it in terms of corporations who have diversity equity initiatives and training their senior leadership, right, where they establish policy and culture in their organizations, thinking about it in educational settings like museums, libraries, but also partnering with teachers, thinking about a meaningful curriculum that might get designed in conjunction with the VR experience. So we're thinking about that. We haven't done it at the primary, secondary level yet. We've integrated it into a class at the School of Social Work called Power, Racism, Oppression, and Privilege, which I helped design, that all of our first-year students have to take, and half of them do the VR in addition to taking the class, and we're interested in whether the VR is adding something meaningful to that experience. And then we're also working with the University of Michigan to think about how they want to integrate into their curriculum. So I think as long as it's combined with a meaningful engagement after you come out of the headset, there's lots of places that you can use it. I don't think it's a one-off where you kind of do a demo for senators or do a demo for CEOs and then they'll be changed. I think that maybe you have a different conversation after they come out than you would have when they were going in. So given that, I think those sorts of spaces that have some commitment to equity, racial equity in particular, and then combining it with a workshop or hopefully something more substantive than that is a great place to use it.
Just following up on that question, I was incredibly moved by the VR demonstration, and I was just wondering how you hope to address potentially low utilization rates of people who understand how difficult it is to be in a position where you have no privilege, yet these privileged people don't want to go through that experience.
So low utilization in terms of whether they actually show up to do the VR?
Yes.
And you think people who think they already get it are less likely to do it?
I'm concerned that people from a position of privilege won't want to go through such a difficult experience and actually live a day in the footsteps of someone who experiences this oppression.
I was concerned about that as well. Like, who wants to volunteer to experience racism? Like, me, sign me up. Actually, at the Tribeca Film Festival, there were a couple of black women who walked by our booth, and they were like, "Oh, is this the racism one?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you want to do it?" And they were like, "Do I get promoted in it?" Then like, "No, I don't want to do it. I don't want additional racism in my life." So yes, it's an issue. But surprisingly, though, I'm being a little bit silly, but surprisingly, though, I was amazed at people rushing up to sign up, at the film festival in particular, to sign up to go through the experience. I feel like if we had done this 5 years ago, crickets, right? Maybe no one would want to talk to us or do this. I think a lot of people are in a different place now where they're more willing to take on difficult experiences and feelings of discomfort in order to move on and to help us all move on collectively. I think that's one benefit of the very vitriolic space that we're in now, that it's just so in your face that for people who may have previously been lulled in some sense that because we had a black president, we were in a different place. So I found in my experience thus far, we've run hundreds of people through it, there's a willingness to deal with the discomfort. There are certainly people who keep walking and don't want to do it, but that hasn't been the response overall.
Thank you. Are you accepting jobs, by the way?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm a first-year physical therapy student. I'm just wondering, kind of going off that same line of thought, how can we fix the issue? Like, you bring up so many good points and so many thoughts, but how can we implement this to get this taken care of?
So I've found, and it's quite frustrating in my own work, that I spend, and I think others spend so much time trying to prove to people that racism matters, that we rarely get to the point of actually trying to do something about it. So I still think the first step is to get more people, this is why I did the virtual reality project, get more people on the same page, that this is not just a thing you mention, this is everything. If you're trying to understand racial patterns in health, for instance, you have to address it directly. And just because it seems messy or difficult to do is no excuse for at least attempting to address the problem. So I think that's the first step.
Yeah, and that comes from such a deep-rooted place too. Like, you're absolutely right. Like, I came from a high school that I could probably count on one hand the number of people of color from there. So it's really like you don't even realize,
Well, yeah, we live in a highly segregated society, and whites are more segregated than everyone else, right? People who aren't white have more integrated lives than people who are white. Absolutely. And so then if you have whites who are implicated in these systems that we're talking about, but have some sense of, well, I'm a good person, and I would never do that or say that, so it's all good, gold star, as opposed to, wait a minute, I'm a part of this, I'm contributing to this. So then we have a different conversation. But it's difficult to do that when you haven't had meaningful contact with people who don't look like you.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Yep.
You mentioned that there's a class that's required for first-year students at the School of Social Work on power and racism. How do we make that required curriculum for all schools? Because it's not just for social work students that should be knowing about power and racism. All schools, regardless of your discipline, should be studying this. And I think, again, in terms of a first step, just being transparent about how this is an issue that affects people regardless of what you study and where you decide to work is definitely necessary.
Yeah. So this is the second year we've had the class, so even social work is just now doing it. And I'm not making any suggestions, but our students basically had an uprising and were like taking over meetings and stuff and demanding that we do this. And not only do the one required course, but think about the implications for all the rest of our curriculum and think about faculty development. So now we're going through multiple training sessions, et cetera. We all need to get up to speed on these issues. So really it came from demands that were made by the students, and we were forced to act. The second thing suggestion I'll make is my colleague, Jonathan Metzel. He has a new book that I'll hype, Dying of Whiteness, that's out now, but he also has this line of work around structural competence that's specifically focused on training physicians around thinking about structural and social issues, and it's a training model and a curriculum that they've developed, and they have a measure to try and assess whether you're actually moving and becoming more complex in your ability to think about these structures. So Metzel, M-E-T-Z-L, but in terms of making it happen in your institution, honestly, it mostly comes from discontent students. Don't blame me, health sciences, if students start showing up at your meetings. Any other questions?
I actually have a question.
Okay.
So you had talked about sort of the thinking of these issues in a broader context and not just blaming the individual. But so I studied nutrition in the master's program here, and I'm a prospective medical student. When you are sort of on a one-on-one situation with a patient, how do you shift that conversation and have that conversation with the patient where you are trying to give them tools, but also understanding that there is this entire system sort of beyond just that individual?
Yeah, we think about this a lot with social workers who have been trained as clinicians, right? They work one-on-one, but we try to train them to consider that that person exists in a context and that might shift the advice and solutions that they come up with, right? So, for instance, there's one paper I signed in my class where there's an Afro-Brazilian living in New York City who came out in the U.S. but hadn't come out to his parents at home and was experiencing depression and anxiety. And the article is basically arguing that you need to consider those multiple contexts, that he doesn't just live here, he also goes home, he's navigating isolation in the U.S. as well, that isolation is not just based on being queer, that isolation is also based on being an immigrant, that isolation is based on being black, etc. And as a clinician, as someone who's engaging with that individual, thinking about all of that with them. And that doesn't mean you can solve and address each of those problems, but you're at least assessing those issues as part of what you're trying to solve. So in terms of nutrition, if you're thinking about not just what are the right foods to eat, why are you not eating them? Do you have access to them? Can you afford them? Is there something I can do to get you access to support so that you can afford more nutritious foods, etc.? Or can I make you aware of existing programs that will help support you as opposed to only giving information about the nutrition?
So hi, I'm Claire Heyman. I'm Director of Mental Health Services here, and I so appreciated this. And I think being in psychology, there is often such a focus on the individual, and so just sort of broadening the frame is so important. And I also am very interested in sort of the impact of embodiment and sort of embodiment of trauma. How are we all holding things? So two questions. One is sort of like very specific about in doing the VR work, is there any sort of tracking of measures of psychophysiological arousal, like heart rate variability or something that sort of map onto some of these chronic stress patterns? And then also sort of from the vein of looking also at ways we're all sort of perpetuating white supremacy, I'm curious if like there's some kind of VR angle into that as well, that maybe it's like in a later stage of development or something.
Thank you. So we found it, I'm interested in the psychophysiology work, and that's part of other work that I've done, but I found it tricky in VR when you're moving around. So with this one, you're standing up, you're sitting down, you're kneeling, so it kind of messes up the measurements. There are people who do it, though, for seated experiences where you're just in one place, but that then becomes a little bit limited in terms of how interactive are you actually being. but it's a trick I would like to solve. We do track, if we don't have full body trackers in this piece, but you can have trackers over the full body, so you can track movement more easily. You can do eye tracking inside of the headset, so pay attention to where people are staring and looking and how long do they stare and look. But the physiological part is actually tricky with this type of experience. And then but important, I think. And actually, our initial proposal built that into the funding, and then we realized, wait a minute, how do we do that? And there's no one on our team who has enough expertise to help us do that. So any of you want to help us do that, that'd be great. And then for the white supremacy piece, we have thought about a piece that helps make whiteness visible, and kind of help white people grapple with being named and grouped along the lines of race, which I find, especially with some of my students, is a challenge to overcome for some people. And then not noticing the ways in which it shaped their day-to-day experiences. So I think it could potentially be a very powerful piece. We haven't started developing yet. It's just in sort of ideation stages. But the flip side of it is really interesting. We did try to, in this piece, try to think about juxtaposing whiteness in very strategic ways. So having the white male friend, having the white job applicant in a mostly white space. So we tried to think about how do we introduce the notion of whiteness and not create experiences where you could come up with alternative explanations. Oh, the receptionist was just being rude. Oh, it was this, it was that. We wanted to make it clear that it was something about race that was happening. We tried to do that anyway. Okay, thanks everyone. Sorry, we have 10 more minutes, so I'll stay after if people have questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cogburn, everyone for their participation. Right now, we are moving on to our morning workshop sessions, which are taking place from 10:45 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. Thank you so much, everyone.